Apparently, I've been avoiding this story. I hate it. I hate it so much. So, this is from The Guardian. Alarm over extreme sentences for anti-ICE protesters convicted of terrorism. And this is what I've been warning you about. This is NSPM 7 in action. First Amendment group calls 50 to 100-year prison terms chilling, as legal experts say sentences are unusually long. They are. So the decades-long prison sentences for a group of Texas activists convicted of terrorism and other charges in connection to a 4th of July protest last year has caused widespread alarm, given their unusually punitive length and for the apparent harsh criminalization of protest activity under Donald Trump's Department of Justice, run by his personal criminal defense attorney, Todd Blanche, the guy who moved the sex trafficker to a camp. Yeah, him. So 8 people who participated in a protest at the Prairie Land ICE detention facility in Alvarado, Texas, were sentenced on Tuesday to between 50 and 100 years in prison. A 9th person, Daniel Sanchez Estrada, the husband of one of the demonstrators, did not participate in the protest, but was sentenced to 30 years in prison after he was convicted of moving boxes containing left-wing zines and other materials after a prison phone call from his wife. Moving boxes? Where have I heard moving boxes? Who was it that moved all those boxes? Oh, Walt Nauta, who moved all of the boxes of classified documents that Donald Trump stole from the fucking White House. That guy should get 30 years in prison if that case could ever come to trial. Motherfuckers, you motherfucking fascist fucks, we're coming for you. These sentences of these people, they will be on appeal, and hopefully they will be completely overturned. These sentences are a travesty and totally unjustified, but that's the point. Americans hate the fascist Trump regime, so the only way they can try to cling to power is through brute force. Representative Rashida Tlaib, a Democrat from Michigan, posted on X, more bullshit terrorism charges like these are coming. Sanchez Estrada's sentence in particular has been condemned by First Amendment advocates who say that it sends a chilling message about the kind of ideological material people are allowed to possess. Yeah, it's weird because all we're seeing from the Department of Homeland Security account is ideological material in the form of white Christian nationalist ideological material. Openly Schnazi ideological material coming straight from the Department of Homeland Security website. Official government accounts. Oh, but never mind that, because this guy, Sanchez Estrada, he had zines. He had little magazines. Yeah, he was punished for moving those magazines, and they're no different from the pro-revolution pamphlets this country's founders had in mind when they drafted the First Amendment's press clause, said Seth Stern, chief of advocacy of the Freedom of Press Foundation. Sanchez's case is the latest example of the Trump administration grasping at any legal straws it can to criminalize disfavored ideologies and writings, from conflating dissent with terrorism to deporting immigrants who report on protests or criticize wars the U.S. bankrolls, he said in a statement. Americans should not make the mistake of believing that Sanchez's sentence only threatens immigrants, leftists, or so-called Antifa members. They're just the low-hanging fruit, not the endgame. The prosecution was closely watched because it was the first case to go to trial after the Trump administration vowed to crack down on Antifa, which is not an organization but a constellation of left-wing ideologies. Prosecutors claim the demonstrators were part of Antifa, filed a broad terrorism charge against them, allowing the Trump administration to claim they had successfully convicted Antifa terrorists. The actual terrorism charge the government got a conviction on, however, is not connected to ideology at all. Of the other 7 defendants, 5 of them received 50-year prison sentences. That includes 2 people who were not involved in planning the protest, arrived late, and left when guards asked them to. Sanchez Estrada's wife, Maricela Ruedo, was sentenced to 70 years in prison. Benjamin Song, the lone person who fired at a police officer and hit him, was sentenced to 100 years in prison. All are likely to pursue an appeal of both their sentence and the conviction. The government wants to take her entire life away because she attended a protest. Nobody died. Lydia Koza, whose wife, Autumn Hill, was sentenced to 50 years in prison, told the Associated Press. Those punishments are unusually long, sentencing experts said. Both of the judges overseeing sentencing, Donald Trump appointee Mark Pittman and George W. Bush appointee Reed O'Connor, stacked the sentences for multiple convictions. It's relatively unusual to see that kind of stacking said Mark Osler, a law professor and sentencing expert at the University of St. Thomas in Minneapolis. Usually the sentence for the core offense is pretty harsh in the federal system, frankly, and there's no need to pile things on. True. O'Connor explained his harsh sentences as necessary to send a message. The need to deter this type of conduct is high, said O'Connor, who also called the attack an assault on democracy. Isn't that like calling the kettle black? Calling the kettle Antifa? This is interesting. While the government's sentencing recommendations remain sealed in this case, what? The government always has a sentencing recommendation. They hand down their sentencing recommendation, and then the judges are supposed to go with the sentencing guidelines, which they come to that based on criminal history, seriousness of the crimes, etc. But the recommended sentences could have been inflated by a terrorism enhancement under the federal sentencing guidelines because of the specific crimes they were found guilty of. The enhancement drives up the seriousness of the offense and the relative criminal history in the calculation judges rely on for the recommendation sentences, says Osler. And Douglas Berman, a law professor at The Ohio State University, who's also a sentencing expert. The terrorism enhancement, he says, it does this sort of double whammy that functionally makes the sentence recommendation from the guidelines extremely long, Berman said. I still can say these are extreme sentences. Even with the recommendation from the federal sentencing guidelines, judges still have the discretion to depart from them. Judges very often go below the guidelines, much more often than they go above, Osler said. A federal judge in Maryland, for example, recently sentenced a woman who pleaded guilty to attempting to assassinate the Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh to 8 years in prison, even though the federal sentencing guidelines recommended 30 years to life. According to the Washington Post, the Justice Department is appealing the sentence to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, saying it should be longer. Oh, don't worry, Department of Justice. The time for long sentences is coming. Still, experts say they were most puzzled by the long sentence for Sanchez Estrada. The 30-year sentence for Estrada is probably the one that, for most people, will come closest to the shocking the conscience, Osler said, simply because this is an activity that took place after the harm occurred, and it's something that's done, within a family context, and frankly, which many people can imagine themselves doing in a similar situation, even if they can't imagine themselves firing a gun at a federal facility. Remember this name. Frank Gatto, a federal prosecutor, said during sentencing, people with that kind of extremist beliefs need extra time in prison. They believe violence is justified. I can't wait for your sentencing, Frank Gatto. Philip Hayes, the attorney for Song, said the activists were a bunch of kids and young adults who really have a really big heart and really wanted their voices to be heard. It was never intended that anybody got hurt. It was never intended that any shots would be fired. These people don't give a fuck about that. And of course they had to do it in a friendly state of Texas, right?